So I have questions for two of the or I guess three presenters. The first for the OCR project, you'd mentioned that you'd used Tesseract, different versions of Tesseract, and then the Google Image Search or Google Image Google Cloud Image. Were you able to get actually useful transcriptions out of Google Cloud, or did you just find that you could search easily with Google Cloud? Like you actually have the transcriptions coming back from the OCR from the cloud?
We do, yeah.
And you found that was better than Tesseract?
Markedly, yes.
Really? Okay. That's awesome. Okay, cool.
I mean, to give you an idea, we did this yesterday with, we just decided we'd do a test case for a couple of things. And we had to think of plays that only played once but played a lot. So the pantomime was a good, so we searched for Humpo, which only played one season, and then we, and the old OCR that the British Library did got, I think it was 69 or 70 instances. The Google Cloud Vision got 103.
And then when you looked at...
But then the question was how many were really there?
Yeah.
And so both of us went through it separately, and then we went through it together, and we're confident that there were actually 113. So the old OCR missed 44 of them. Our new OCR misses about 11.
And the old OCR was Tesseract, is that right?
Tesseract.
It would have been the
it?
old.
It was just Adobe.
I mean, we didn't do
Yeah.
it.
The British Library, when I reached out to them, someone wrote me and told me that they had used Abby.
Yeah, they just used Adobe. But so this was or Abby Fine Rated Part. Yeah, exactly. Part, which is Adobe. But
Before we started using Google Cloud Vision, we tried via the Texas A&M supercomputer. We tried all the other ones. We just kept, we thought we'd test it out, and the results were terrible. Way worse than the Abby results usually. I mean, they were wretched.
yeah.
And that's why we thought we'd just keep using our database and doing the rich tagging until the Google Cloud Vision stuff came back, and suddenly it was just like, oh my God.
And how many processor minutes or hours did that take to process the whole thing?
Enormous amount of time. I don't know for sure. We did it through a they're working on a DH dashboard at Texas A&M, and one of the features of this dashboard is the ability to upload images and have them OCR'd by various engines or send it out to Google Cloud Vision, and it took I mean it was.
It took 4 months.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
The site was new.
Yeah.
Every time we'd try to do anything, it wouldn't work. We'd have to write to Eric at Texas A&M, and about 2 weeks later, Eric would figure out the next bug in the system.
And
it really was baby steps.
And then on top of that, just however much time it took on the Google, their API to do it.
Yeah.
I don't even know how. There's no stats on that information.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
But it's a very slow process of transferring data to the A&M dashboard, and then they transfer each image to Google, and they're 4 megabyte images, things like that sometimes. So.
And then for Laura, I was wondering, it seems like the way that you did the project is kind of what I would consider the ideal way of doing it. So now that you've done the ideal way, like what are the things that you've learned that are not actually ideal about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've tested the crowdsourcing with different groups, and I think I would probably pare down the number of fields we request. And it became a little complex because there's things like, and we were using Zooniverse's out-of-the-box crowdsourcing platform, so there were some limitations to how we could direct people. For example, like, transcribe the first performance on the playbill, and then on the next screen you'll have an opportunity to transcribe the second performance. So there were some issues like that I think I'd want to sort out, and as I say, possibly kind of refine the number of fields that we do. In terms of the transcription, I think it's been working pretty well. What I'm really interested in, which is why I'm really glad we have this sort of extended period of crowdsourcing, is whether a kind of hybrid approach, if you could get enough crowdsourced participation that it would save somebody like Sam time doing the actual transcribing of the playbill or your OCR work, and then the work of a student or myself or whoever it is who's coming in and adding the URIs to make it linked data, is on top of that, either OCR or like a community transcription project. So I think that thinking about doing that kind of hybrid approach might be very fruitful. But yeah, I think it might be it might be a good conversation to think about where also, because we did go through for the whole, 9 yards in terms of everything you could transcribe. And I know that you guys did something similar for the taking that you've been doing. And I think it might be worth thinking about, well, are there a few places that we could have? But to be honest, I think the actors' names are the thing that takes the longest, just in terms of transcription time, and that's really, the thing you want. So adding something like the price of the tickets isn't that big a deal, But I was actually very pleased with the time it took. It took us less time than we thought it would for her to just sit down and transcribe, even with adding the URIs in.
I'll throw something out. Maybe for the whole day, but certainly for what I heard just now. Wonderful stuff. The Tyranny of Place. The Folger project being perhaps the most wonderful and kind of troubling example of we organize by place. We fight about theaters within place, but Philadelphia Playbills. You've shown us some amazing work with what the provinces mean and how that relates to center and periphery, and all of your cards were entirely place-centered to your pleasure and torture. It sounds like, and for every, that's a necessary and fascinating organizational tool. But is it also an intellectually limiting one in a history of theater that, as we heard about today, which is about movement, which is about, which is not necessarily place-specific and perhaps shouldn't be? Just a thought.
I think that you're first.
If I can actually use Laura's project as an example, I think that's one of the neat things about... A little closer. Sorry, I'm bad with microphones. But to use Laura's project as a starting example, that's actually one of the things that I think is really neat about linked data, is being able to just say, not this is how we are organizing our collection, our data, etc., but just here's a fact about an item, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can prioritize that. You can say that you're not interested in it. You can say that this fact is exactly equal to all of these other facts. This performance took place in Philadelphia. Edwin Booth was involved in this performance. So it doesn't have to be nearly as hierarchical, and and any kind of structured data starts to approach that. But then a system like JSON LD really gets even further. And to be a little bit idealistic, I think that's really cool.
And I mean, this is just a very basic point, but I realized during your presentation that it was an advantage that our playbills had actually already been sorted according to place, because when I found things that just said theater at the top, it was a clue oftentimes that it was Chestnut Street because it was the first theater in town, and so, although not always. But I realized that it made it much easier for me than for you, where, I was taking out, when I was putting up the exhibit, there was a volume of Boston playbills I put in there, and it said just theater at the top, and I thought, if these were just loose in a drawer with the Philadelphia ones, I can see it would suddenly become a much harder task. But I do think that that's one virtue of having focused on Philadelphia, is that in some ways actually focusing on place is just helpful in terms of allowing you to really, get to know the local actors and the families and the, sort of groups who coalesce, the sort of spheres of community that coalesce around a place. And I think that's why we're all here on this table, is that we're all working in different geographic locations, and then we can bring them together, as opposed to trying to take on the world, which is like literally what you were trying to do.
Really only just skimming the surface.
All the way to Japan.
One thing that I'd like to add is Scott and my sort of fantasy when we were doing the database, which I would actually recommend. It's actually one of the things that very early on when we were working with novels back in the, a long time ago, actually trying to figure out how to structure a database is one of the greatest theoretical exercises that you can do. It sort of teaches you things about things like authorship that you didn't know before, or about the difference between place, company, what is a performance? What is a night at the theater? Just really fundamental things. And so even though the OCR kind of changed things, it does seem to me that there's a really interesting, it's not a tension, it's just, it's kind of two halves of things. One is, if you're interested in creating really good data for other people to use. And that's what we were sort of thinking about, especially with the database. But if Scott and I were going to write an essay next, I still think we'd title it In Praise of Dirty Data. You know, you could pick the movie poster you want for dirty data. Because at least when I was in grad school, the smartest people who taught me were the ones who constantly asked questions about the relationships between entities rather than just about one entity. And geography is merely one way you can think about that. You can also think over time. You can also, like one of the things I would love to do is create a visualization for you pick the actor or actress where you could see what their repertoire was over a 5-year period and how that might grow, shift, change, and finally narrow. If you were interested in, say, what happens when people age on the stage, how do their roles change? And that's just a relationship problem. And the reason the OCR is so exciting in a way is because, as I said, we were able to map, I mean, Master Betty has a really complicated itinerant life, and it took 4 hours, and we basically nailed it. And the OCR just sits there, so you can almost ask a question and basically look at your watch and say, do I have 4 to, you know, somewhere between 2 and 8 hours, and come up with a really good answer. But that's really different from, I mean, I'm more interested these days in what kinds of questions we can ask. But I still think that having great data, you can ask such complicated questions with what Laura's doing, or with the JSON data that we were able to generate. But it takes so much time and it's so expensive.
It takes a lot to generate, and the advantage is that there's a sort of a difference in replicability, you might say. I mean, the work that we do that we did, you know, with the OCR was, you know, I think, much more rigorous than it could have been before with the earlier OCR, but you know, it was not automated. It was not something that you could just run the query and get a result. Again, from the data, it's like we'd have to go through that process, and so it's.
I mean, the best way to put it is you could use the OCR to ask a question and figure out whether there was a there, but the data that got produced wouldn't really be useful. I mean, if you're lucky, you'd get 40 or 50% of it, and you'd still have to end up going through all the stuff. You know, you'd at least sort of know what you were looking for, and that's great. But with these, it's almost like I got the answer. You know, I guess I could find the other 10%, and where necessary, I will. But most of the time, it's not necessary.
Well, you kind of answered the question there. I was just going to ask, like, how do you envision the data being used? And I mean, you explained it partially in your presentation, and then again there. But
Suggestions, because we're at the beginning.
well, I mean, like you said, it could be anything. I like this idea of repertoire, how it changes as an actor goes through their life. I mean, you know, there's plain, you know, hand counting things like what's the most popular play in, you know, Victorian England. You know, you could assume, you could guess what some of them were, but it'd be nice to see what the numbers are. You know,
For me, the remorse and Harlequin and Humpo thing was I want to find as many of those as I can.
Yeah.
Where you would think these plays have nothing to do one another, and then you read them and you go, oh my God, they're both, you know, basically piss takes on Napoleon. And that's why, and it's 1813 and Napoleon's losing, and that's why audiences are filling the house.
I'd also be curious how quickly a play circulates from like the metropole to the provinces. You know, like
It takes about 3 years.
okay, well that's longer than I thought. I know, like famously, Pirates of Penzance, right, was performed in London, and then what? 6 days later, there was a debut in New York City, the pirate version.
It
So
depends on whether the theater manager owns the intellectual property. Like George
Right.
the Younger at the Haymarket never printed his plays, so they got pirated.
right.
When they get printed like a month into the run, then you do see it popping up way earlier, like you're noting. 6 days, though, that's good.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if it was that.
Yeah,
Doug,
Pirates was the same night. Pinafore was almost like
like
Oh, it's
like a
just
week. Yeah.
Pirates.
Yeah.
Well, that was sort of the joke of Pirates, yeah.
Sorry. When you have laryngitis, you just end up doing stand.
I had another question for Sarah. Is just I don't know if you can answer it. Maybe you would have, but like, so Playbills are on pause, but like, what's the future of that? Like, obviously, the project created problems in the sense that, as you suggested, but like, is is there kind of a plan to deal with it? And then a secondary question to that was just like, what was the process of appraisal when you think about what to catalog, or how, I would look at something like, let's say we had 7 Czech playbills or something. I would say, don't bother cataloging them because no one's going to come to Harvard to study Czech theater because they're outliers, right? And so let's focus on something else. I'm just wondering about the future of the project, and then like what the choices that went into, item level cataloging, kind of these things.
So I think to answer the second part of that first, I started mainly with the playbills that seem to most support our mission at the Folger. And since we are centered around Shakespearean England and early modern Europe and 19th Shakespearean theater to the present day, so I started with the London playbills because that seemed to be the most central to that. And I believe I would have kept just sort of moving outwards from that point if I would not have done item level cataloging for the foreign playbills, except that it seemed like that was necessary because they didn't have the shelf list available. If I'd realized that the shelf list was with the playbills, I would have just separated that from the start, and then gotten caught up in looking at all the playbills and going, ooh, neat.
But they're beautiful.
Yeah,
Those were the most beautiful images I've seen.
Yeah, and they're like it's really a good thing that I was not working with the physical playbills themselves that much, because I just get so caught up in looking at all of the graphic design and illustrations and everything. And as to what is next for the playbills, I unfortunately don't have an answer. Hopefully, I imagine there will be something at this point. We are certainly thinking about maybe applying for like a hidden collections grant or something like that. I think the final decision would be above my pay grade, but hopefully there is something, and I know it's of interest and it's under discussion. So
Could you let us know if writing to certain people would put pressure on it? We don't have to say you told us. We can say we saw your talk.
I mean, if you want to,
Just let us know what the desire, what you'd like.
I can let you know some names if you.
Okay. All right. I think we should, because for me, the question's always been like, I've always got, I mean, one of the things I love about this library, and I love this library more than any library I've ever worked in, is that they want people to see the stuff, and they don't care if it's an undergraduate with grubby, well, they make them clean their hands, but if it's an undergraduate or an esteemed professor, there's a kind of use value theory that works here, which is it's useless if people aren't using it. And it seems to me that with playbills, you've got an interesting problem, which is if people don't know they're there, or if they aren't cataloged, they don't get used, which means that they're useless on the one hand, but they don't get used. And unless you produce really good data, virtual data, so that people don't have to handle them, what you've got is a lot of uselessness in nearly every scenario. Yeah, and it's just really heartbreaking to think about it that way, but it's kind of, it seems to me, the way it is.
Yeah, and we're in kind of a frustrating middle ground there.
Yeah, and that's why
we have some data and we have some use, and we could have a lot more.
Yeah, and that's why
a lot of other things.
I was
also.
honestly asking whether because I would be happy to write and just say, I'm thrilled that you guys were working with him. What's next, and put a little pressure.
Well, hopefully we will all go forth from this conference, writing and
That's right.
making more things happen for our theater
I'm just
collections
gonna
everywhere.
I'm just gonna go forth. That sounds nice.
Question in the back.
Well, I guess my question is kind of around what you're talking about. Before these projects came about, did you guys have a lot of, people who were interested in playbills? Like, where did these ideas come from? And were people interested before, now that they are online and available, or becoming available?
Scott, do you want to lean in on that, or Laura?
Well, I can give a
or-
very
or
concrete
Sarah.
answer, which is that I think Zach Lesser, who's currently in Italy but is a professor in our English department, and Michael Gamer in the same week were asking me about our playbills collection, and I was walking them back to the stacks to look at it, and that's when I started thinking, I thought about them before, but I think it was because there was some faculty interest sort of simultaneously from different locations. And what's been interesting is since having the images up and having the cataloging, I mean, I think there has been more attention paid to these images. You know, we're using them more ourselves just because we're more aware that they're there, you know, and they're also now, because they're out there online and people can see them, they're more likely to say, oh, that's the kind of thing I could see in the Penn collections. And so that's one real value right there of doing this kind of digital work.
I think ours.
I would just add to that, that in the 1960s, which is for most people in this room ancient history, when I was in graduate school, the person who taught me 18th century drama was a person named George Stone. And George Stone used playbills in the 1960s, and he'd been using them for a long time, along with a person here at the University of Pennsylvania named Joe Schouten. And one of the illustrations that we saw on the screen earlier this afternoon of the London stage was a product that was built in large part on the study of playbills from the 1660 to 1800 period, which cut off in the middle of Dr. Gamer's interests to his dismay. But those playbills were something that people have been interested in for a very, very long time indeed.
I mean, for me, it's really, it's a pedagogical issue, but also if you're interested in the material objects, not just that comprise an archive, but the London stage in a way is sort of, I was lucky. I mean, in my period, almost no one studies the drama because there's such good fiction. There's a lot of war, there's such good poetry. But the London stage is pretty transparent about where they get their information from. And for example, right now I'm teaching an introductory course mostly to freshmen on Jane Austen, and the first thing I'm asking them to do, because Paula Byrne wrote a really good biography, Paula Byrne's really good at noting a sort of Austen myth, telling you very transparently about what data there is, and then thinking through the data and coming up with, you know, other ways, other conclusions you could come to, while explaining why we got the myth, which is usually the Austen family, who curated her reputation very closely. For me, playbills are really, really concrete and fascinating objects. They're really entertaining to look at, but it's also, they're literally the pieces out of which you can make history. And what's most interesting is they're recording something that's ephemeral. I mean, unlike things like novels and poetry, we encounter theater history always, like, it's always been remediated, which is not a word I like, but I can't think of a better one. You know, it was a performance, it's already been transformed into words on a page, right? And so my approach has always been take as many different print and image and, well, you know, basically printed approaches to the same event as you can, whether it's a newspaper review, whether it's an anecdote, whether it's the playbills, because it's the only way you're going to get at it. And for me, that's a really teacherly moment, because you can literally teach people how to make something, whether it's a book like The London Stage or trying to figure out the history of putting live horses on stage, which you can do. But does that make sense? I mean, for me, it's almost a theory question. As a materialist, I want to know the materials, how much of those we have, how reliable they are, what materials are missing. And I really love that.
Sarah, I was wondering if it had been possible, or if it is possible, to just digitize all the playbills and then get 90% OCR accuracy, would that result, what would be lost in doing that rather than catalog or regenerate or generating electronic catalog records from the cards?
I would say the structured data, having authorized forms that you can connect other controlled vocabularies.
Right, but so, yes, but how would that affect research? Like losing that structured form?
As not a theater historian, I can't provide a good answer for that. I would say that would sort of necessitate a sort of a closer look style research rather than broader big data style research. I can't really speak to it beyond that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's essentially why I thought it was important to do structured data for my project, because, I mean, you know, if you want to just search for names, obviously a blob of text does fine, but if you want to start thinking about relationships in more nuanced ways, you really need that kind of structure. I think that's why you were going for the JSON structure as well.
That's right, yeah. And there's a huge range. I mean, we've seen plenty of examples, Mr. Williams and so on, right? But even when names are fuller like that, there's all sorts of ambiguities that when you're doing, if you're just searching through OCR, you have to go in and look and say, okay, is this the same person? No. You know, and in some cases you can do that resolution quickly, and in some cases you can't, and you really would have to go back to the document, to the collection, understand the context in which it was collected in order to really make those distinctions. And so if you can get that structured data, you don't have to worry about that. So it's definitely, I mean, OCR, I think it's exciting because it shows what we can do now, but I think in the long run, having that structured data is really, really important for research.
I also have a pretty good cautionary tale. One of the first things Scott and I did 2 years ago with the old OCR is we thought, well, what are some questions we can ask? And so we thought, I know. There's a phrase that appears a lot in Playbills called first appearance, and there's a lot of varieties. It can be his first appearance in this character or her first appearance on this stage, but it might often even be like, Ms. Aydelotte of Edinburgh Theatre, her first appearance on the stage. And that's what we were interested in, because we were trying to figure out how theaters, we thought we could figure out by tracing first appearance, how theaters, which theaters fed which theaters, basically. Like, where do London performers come from? We had this really ambitious thing, and we were feeling so smug. So even when first appearance in this character came up, Scott said, I know, we'll just get rid of all the ones that have character in it. And then we started looking for theater names or city names or place names within 2 vertical lines of, say, Ms. Aydelotte, her first appearance on this stage, right? And we had this great idea, and as long as those place names weren't the same as the place that you were already in or the theater you were already in, right? So if you're in London at Drury Lane, then you wouldn't use those, right? The idea that if, something like, well, to cut to the chase, we produced this beautiful visualization with London at the center and different provinces feeding London, and even, sort of lines indicating stronger or weaker relationships. And we started looking at this, and I'm saying, wow, York really fed London. That's great. And Richmond, is that the Richmond Theatre near London? No, it's got to be the one in Yorkshire. There was tin mining there. Yeah, Richmond really, wow, I didn't know Richmond was so important. And Shrewsbury, who knew Shrewsbury was such a feeder for London? And then we realized we had produced a perfect map to the Henriade, Shakespeare's history books. Because, of course, characters are named places. And there's really not, I mean, we figured out that we could just say, if it's Henry V, ignore, right? But oh my God, it's the best story ever. And I'm still laughing thinking about it, because it took us so long to recognize what we were looking at. We were like, jeepers, Richmond matters. Wow, we've got groundbreaking stuff here. So that's why you need that's why you need richly tagged data. That's where we are frauds, and fall down. But it's still, I mean, I'm glad we did it just for that story. Yeah. But I think that kind of answers your question both ways, I think.
Anyone else?
I mean, the German theater is somewhat different structured than the Anglo-American theater. I partially indicated that there is, whereas almost a new play every day. And I had an idea of what I'd like to see done. I've also done a lot of work with the theater rules and regulations where they tell how long an actor has to learn his role. I also know that they had strong censorship, which the play had to be approved by the censor before it even be studied. There also the roles had to be written out for each actor. And I was thinking it'd be an interesting thing to try to figure out on the basis of information on the playbills how long actors actually had to really learn these things. There's so many discrepancies in the material, which when I read the rules and regulations and then think about the practice, I'm sort of reminded of John Irving's cider house rules, where the rules are there, but they're never followed because they're only there for the things. And I think if I'd like to try to do this with German theater, some of the things, the playbills and whatnot I've worked over I don't know how I'm going to do that. Of course, I don't have the facilities at my disposal, which you've got at your disposal. I wish I did, but I don't. But this is another type of question I'd like to use playbills to find out more about structures behind the scenes and not just what happens in front of the scenes.
One way you could do it would be to, depends on, it would take longer or shorter depending on how much data you have, but you could focus on, say, you could choose 5 actors, and if you're willing to take some time, it would probably take a couple of weeks at least, if probably a month, to really look at what they play when. If you got a good enough order, you could figure out when something is a new role. And it's not like when you're playing Hamlet, you couldn't also in the mornings be learning how to be Iago, but it would at least give you a sense. That's one way you might be able to do that with different kinds of rules. You could figure out things like how many times do players play in a week? How often do they play in multiple shows in one night? You could do it pretty fast. It would take about a month, but if you got a good answer, that's a month pretty well spent. I don't know if other people have other ideas. Oh wow.
So this might be kind of question of almost of fantasy, but so you're talking about how the OCR technology has really increased in relatively short amount of time. So if you're thinking about the time frame of these kind of projects, which can take years from the very first inkling of a project to the end point, and given how fast the technology is moving, are there projects or things you guys would want to do that you can't quite do yet, but that you think in 3 years, in 5 years, in 7 years will be possible?
I follow a lot of the developments in machine learning. I do a bunch of text analysis and DH stuff. So, and I think that my feeling is that right now, the kinds of work that we're talking about right now is creating the data sets that will be used to train the next stage of machine learning algorithms that handle this kind of stuff. And I feel that way, and I mean that really specifically because I think playbills are an incredibly valuable use case or test case for machine learning algorithms because they're really hard, with the different layouts and different fonts and so on, and they change rapidly over time. I think that is, I think it's the kind of data set that computer scientists right now will look at and say, that's a challenge, it's a challenge within reach, and if we can start building those data sets, that's what's going to enable that next stage of research. And I think we'll start seeing things like maybe we might start to see the possibility in 5 or 10 years of getting structured data out of OCR, not just unstructured, but actually being able to start to parse out characters and roles and things like that. I don't think we're not there yet, and I don't think we'll be there for a few more years, but it could start happening in 10 or 5 or 10 years, and
because
it would be really exciting to be able to then start doing those kinds of queries. But it won't happen unless we're already creating this data now.
We were just showing you the unstructured OCR, and we've still got to figure out how to get out of Texas A&M's interface, actually get our data. But we also did JSON data, which is where every single letter and word is geographically marked. And you can tell by how many playbills you've looked at today, it would be fairly easy to figure out where benefit night is, because it's usually announced at the top, or where printer names are, because they're pretty much at the bottom, or pricing. And we don't know how to do it yet, but I think we're closer than we think. And we might move very quickly to working with just, instead of the text OCR, you saw the JSON. The problem is that every single playbill is at least 4 megabytes that way. And you'd multiply that by 100,000, and it's like, oh my God, my poor laptop.
You might want to expand beyond.
Yeah,
just your
it'll
laptop,
die.
yeah.
No. Me and this laptop are going down together. But that's where we're thinking next. In terms of questions, if any of you think of questions that you would want to ask Playbills, write to me, because we really are at sort of the beginning of like, what can we ask? How long would it take to answer X? And we can do things like, we don't have to just trace one thing. We've got a good enough search engine so that we can pipe, say something like Shakespeare, or, let's get off Shakespeare, actually, let's do Drury, pipe Drury into Harlequin, into Farley, to get every single pantomime, or at least Harlequinade, that Charles Farley appeared in, and do it like that. So we're already there. And when you can ask relationship questions like that, you get that list versus who's playing Harlequin at, at Covent Garden or in New York. I mean, you can do things pretty fast again. I mean, so I'm really interested in playing with this stuff.
It'd be really great if you just get a set of like 1,000 out.
Yeah.
That, kind of like a sandbox thing.
Yeah.
Let people have at it. I mean, again, I'm going to send you an email.
Yeah, okay.
What I'm interested in. But at any rate, if you just put it out there and just see what people do with it,
Yeah.
what happens.
That's a good idea. Very good
But
idea.
I understand the limitations on
Yeah.
what you're saying with the full set, but
Yeah.
even a subset could be,
Yeah.
if it was a decade, a particular area of something that gave it a structure,
Yeah.
it would be fun to play with.
All right. So I think this is the end. Yes, we can all. I just some parting remarks. I want to thank you all for coming and being such a wonderful audience and a really participating audience. I think we've had some great conversation across the last couple of days. I want to thank my fellow staff members. I don't know if John and Lynn are still in the room, but they've been great help throughout this process. Alita Arthurs, who set up last night's wonderful reception. All the great staff at the Kislak Center, Will Knoll, our director. I'm probably forgetting people to thank, but I thank you all. Eddie Musicani, I can see you sitting right there. And yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. We're going to open the Lee Library a little bit longer to look at materials for those who haven't already. And I think that's all. Yeah.